Welcome to the Music Reel. I'm your host, Nicola Burton. I have two pushy boys here with me today, Manny and Mark. And our very special guest, we have Clubs Queensland spokesman Dan Nipperess, who's very kindly agreed to talk to us today. Now, Clubs Queensland is the voice behind the changing face of community clubs in Queensland. Now, it provides connections and resources in the areas of education, government representation, training, anything that's new in hospitality. And look, especially at this time of uncertainty with lockdown restrictions beginning to ease, Clubs Queensland is there for its venues, trying to, provide strategies and plans and perhaps an industry COVID-safe plan for when we actually get back to business. So, Dan, it's a pleasure to have you today. How are you going?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Look, it's a busy time for any peak industry body, I think, given the current pandemic and certainly for the club industry as well, being one of those industries that was forced to close back in late March.
That's right.
You know, we've seen the effects of the closure of the whole hospitality industry. You know, it's not just specific to clubs, but also to hotels and restaurants and cafes and any other form of hospitality. So, look, it's been a tough couple of months, but you know, we're a very resilient industry. All of the staff and volunteers and members that form part of any community club are very, very resilient. And following on from the Premier's announcements on Sunday, it's good to see those stage 2 restrictions being brought forward.
Yes.
And so we can sort of return to some sort of normality, hopefully, in the next couple of weeks in the lead up to stage 3 in July.
We have everything crossed. But look, I guess in modern history, we've never had so many changes in this hospitality industry as we have right now, and in particular for live music. So I guess my question's for you, and I'm sure you're fielding this everywhere. What will live music artists have to think about now in terms of induction, what they do on stage, how they interact with audiences? In your industry COVID-safe plan, have you got a section for live music artists in terms of what they need to consider now when they come and perform at a club?
Look, the industry COVID-safe plan, I'll just a bit of background. So these are industry plans prepared by industry, so the peak bodies such as Clubs Queensland, and they really are designed in a way to cater for all venues. So for hospitality, you'll have one industry plan for licensed venues, which will be, you know, your pubs, hotels and clubs, and then you'll have a separate one for restaurants and cafes. Now, our industry plan is quite an extensive document, and it needs to be, because there's a lot of different elements to any licensed venue. Specific for live performers and artists, they would probably have to, that while they don't have their own separate section, there's a lot referenced in the COVID safe plan that they would need to ensure compliance with, and that the venues will be asking those performers to comply with. Essentially, what I would suspect as we move through this is that any live performer would be treated in very much the same way as a contractor or an employee in terms of those sorts of obligations. So, you know, that's going to kick in from the second that they arrive at a venue, when that's loading in the equipment at a loading dock or through any main thoroughfare area of the club. Right up to the way that they interact with patrons, the setting up of their equipment. I'm not going to say it's not going to be very onerous, though. You know, they're the sorts of common sense things that we've already been subjected to since stage 1, and that a lot of us already have to deal with. For example, when we just pop down to the local shops or to the shopping centre, you know, it's maintaining the social distancing, it's ensuring high standards of hygiene, washing your hands, and all of those sorts of things. So, you know, I'm saying that we do need to be vigilant, but it's not particularly onerous.
No, that's great to hear. Over to you, Manny.
Yes, Dan, thanks for coming on and having a chat to us. I guess, you know, without going into any great detail and having read, you know, any of the plans for the hospitality industry comprehensively, my concern is that we might end up with a one solution fits all scenarios when you know, and when we all know that clubs have have various ranges of I suppose, sub-venues, you know, within the complex.
Yes.
I guess what I'm looking at is what I've read so far. Yeah, I think it's all like it's all common sense. But then is there a particular scenario for feature venues which have got auditoriums, which have got large capacities? What would come into play for something like that? Is there any specific mechanism for numbers in venues, and, you know, how do you seat people? How do you, you know, usher them into like an auditorium? Will auditoriums likely be the last bastion to open?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I guess to answer the first part of it, when you're going to see any intricacies of particular venues, there's always going to be instances like that. Government were aware of that when they asked industry how we're going to approach this, and we certainly thought of it as we were drafting these plans. Specific venues, specific to community clubs, for example, will still need to sign off on a statement of compliance for the industry plan, but then they may go further in terms of developing it at a local level that might be specific to their venue. So you're right. There's never a one-size-fits-all solution to these sorts of things. Government recognises that. But this is probably the most pragmatic way that they can ensure that COVID-safe plans are done timely in order to get these venues open, and also really going back to industry to say, look, you guys know your industries better than we do, so you tell us what needs to happen to make them safe. In relation to large auditoriums, look, it's a difficult question, and one would need to have a look at the the Queensland state government health directives and the roadmap to see when those large auditorium style performances will be able to recommence. Obviously, the restrictions in licensed venues are quite strict in terms of overall numbers. So, as of the Premier's announcement on Sunday just gone, you're now allowed to have 20 in a particular venue. As of this Friday, once the COVID-safe plans are approved, it may go to 20 in each individual area of a venue. So you might have 20 in the bar, 20 in the bistro, 20 in an outdoor area. And then obviously stage 3 is when the overall cap can go up from there. And you're seeing those other parts of industries reopening. When I have discussions with the members, a lot of them really aren't looking until stage 3 for them to reopen, because especially for your larger clubs that host performances, it's just not commercial for them to do so. If I'm to take a large RSL, for example, I was talking to one of their managers the other day, and she needed 12 staff just to open the venue. And when you've got staff of 12 and you're letting in 20, commercially it makes, they'll be sustaining heavy losses. So
Absolutely.
yeah, it's going to be difficult. And, you look at the government's rationale for that is to obviously prevent at this stage large gatherings of people. So yeah, when are we going to see crowds return to sport? When are we going to see it return for live music performances?
Exactly.
I
wish I knew the answer to that venue, that question.
Yeah. But it's interesting to see the scenario of, sorry, just to interject, is that they're looking at larger sporting venues with allowing 500 people. So they've actually got a plan in place as to how they would, control those 500 people. But I'm not seeing the same scenario for 500 people when it comes to live venues on, say, the hospitality side of things. So it seems to be that the sport, not that I'm saying that sport is being prioritised, but there is a strategy in place for 500 people to attend a sporting event versus 500 people coming to a venue. We've got no clarification on that from anyone at the moment. So I'm really curious from your point of view is, great, because you've got sporting venues. So they're going to, so you've got clubs that are actually attached to sporting grounds. So you've all got a plan in place. I'm really curious how You know,
Yeah, look, our plan is strictly in relation to the licensed venue. Department of Sporting and Recreation with the state government have got their own COVID safe plans developed for the playing of community sports, which is really the extent that community clubs have any affiliation to a certain degree. So, you know, you're looking at the other more elite sports that are making applications for these increased numbers. Are often quite separate to that of the community club and the licensed premises, which is, for example, where you would see, you know, some of these live performers entertaining. Now, with the COVID safe plans and the roadmap to recovery, we're heavily restricted in terms of, you know, what those overall capped numbers are in the whole venue, for example. So, you know, it is something that government is going to have to consider to have these large gatherings indoors.
Yeah.
If I'm to make an assumption about how we may see this progress, as the roadmap to recovery goes on, hopefully as we see low infection rates in Queensland, you're going to see venues probably move to somewhat of an uncapped number inside. Whether that's going to still have particular caps in certain areas of the licensed venue, you might still see that. But I think for the purposes of your typical community club or hotel, over the next sort of stages of the easing of restrictions, it will open up more naturally to those performances being able to take place.
No, that's great. Thank you. And over to you, Mark.
All right, from an artist perspective, look, we have a gig safe plan for our live artists, and obviously we're going to be working with the COVID-19 safe plan to ensure the artists are prepared for whatever comes up. But I suppose the question is, what's the most important thing for a live music act to keep in mind when they're going to be performing in clubs and pubs moving forward?
Look, I think probably the most critical thing is to educate yourselves about what that venue's COVID safe plan is. So it's probably really going to come back on the individual venue to provide that information to the artists. You know, I wouldn't want to see them having to make that assumption or chasing something like that before they get there. You know, there's obviously enough for the artists to be thinking about when they're you know, moving into these venues, and you know, they've got their performance to consider, set lists and all of these sorts of things. So I think having an understanding about what the venue's expectation to COVID safe practices are, probably complying with the directions given to them by that particular venue in relation to how they move into the venue, and also how they are performing on stage and interacting with patrons. Look, you've asked a really, really good question, and you know, where we are at the moment, you know, one can really only speculate where this may go moving forward. You know, I say this to all my members, and you know, I guess that filters down to contractors and employees, and for example, live music artists, that we've only just got to a stage where we're allowing seated dining in venues, because what we're receiving from the Chief Health Officer, Dr. Young, has got particular concerns with people moving around venues, crossing paths, gathering at bar areas, and obviously, if you're to take that to the extreme, which is really what you know, any live artist doesn't want to hear, dance floors. You know, and those areas up close to the stage where people will intermingle. That's what the real concern is. So you see the policy and the health directives behind why they want people seated at tables, is so they can monitor them, they can monitor the numbers. They're not moving around aside from potentially exiting and entering the venue, as well as going to the bathroom, for example. So yeah, it's you know, you really got to consider where we might be going with live music in venues with those restrictions as they are at the moment. So, but yeah, like, to answer your original question, that's sort of what I would say is probably the most critical element for any live artist, is to ensure compliance with the COVID safe plan in the venue that you're performing in.
Well, Dan, you've given everyone so much to think about today. We really appreciate your time talking to us and talking to our artists about what to expect in this post-COVID world when they're going out and performing in clubs Thank you so much for your time today, Dan. We wish you well with all of these crazy plans that you've got ahead of you for the next few months. We don't envy you your job, but look,
Great fun wading through the regulations.
I can imagine.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Dan, once again.
My
We
pleasure.
really
Thank you
appreciate
for having
you.
me.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Dan. Cheers.
See ya.